Welcome to episode 21 of the Aspiring STEM Geek. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Eric Masanet. Eric is the Professor and Chair of Sustainability Science at the University of California at Santa Barbara. The core focus of the conversation is on data centers. We start the conversation with Eric defining what a data center is at a high level, the stakeholders of a data center, GPU versus CPU compute, the life cycle of chips, potential energy efficiency gains that may come from chips, data center water and electricity usage, the sparse data on data centers, and finally, we talk about potential best and worst case scenarios when it comes to the sustainability of data centers. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Dr. Eric Masanet, thank you so much for coming on. Excited to talk about this because we'll be talking about data centers for most of the conversation, and it is a very hot topic. When I was in finance, it was the hot topic in the utility sector, but nobody outside of finance that studied utilities really cared about data centers. So it's been really interesting to see so many people, just the average layman, become interested in this.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the hottest topics in the energy field and the resource field, no doubt about it. Finance field as well, and that's come about due to the AI boom.
And so, but before we get into data centers, I do want to start at the beginning. So, growing up, were you interested in science, engineering, or math?
My interest in those subjects came a bit later. But what I was interested in was building things. When I was a kid, I was always fixing my bike, expanding, my bike with new parts. Anytime there was a chance to assemble something, I was always all over it. So I just like making stuff, and that's what I knew really excited me. That's what I knew I wanted to do. You know, pretty much in my career, I wasn't sure how. And it was only when I sort of landed on engineering as a way to become a product designer, which is what I did in the first part of my career, that I really started appreciating the role of math and science. And I think physics was the first course that really excited me about, how we can use equations and science and our understanding of the physical world to actually predict things that, as engineers, we can put into action by designing things.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear. And I was probably even a later bloomer than you when it came to STEM, but I'm glad that I fell into it. So for your undergraduate, you attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You majored in mechanical engineering. Was there a course that motivated you to study mechanical engineering, or did you just know going in that you were going to study it?
I think, since I liked building things and I liked understanding how parts fit together and things worked and taking things apart, mechanical engineering was a natural choice for me. But I'll be honest, I didn't really come to it, very scientifically, right? I didn't compare chemical and industrial to mechanical. I just knew that I wanted to design and build stuff. So mechanical engineering was kind of felt like the right place for me. And, the first courses that I really, I think, excited me about what I could do as an engineer were the material science courses, just understanding how stress and strain would affect how a material behaves in a product. Once I learned how to start applying the basic physics and chemistry to applied problems, I was pretty much hooked on my mechanical engineering curriculum.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I know when I teach, application is just clicks for 70 to 80% of people. I know, including myself, when it comes to theory, that it's harder for me. But when I can actually apply statistics to like a process, for example, trying to figure out wait times at a hospital, it makes a lot more sense. So, yeah, application is awesome. So so after your undergraduate, you attended Northwestern University for your master's in mechanical engineering. Then you went on to your PhD in mechanical engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. Your PhD thesis is titled Environmental and Economic Take-Back Planning for Plastics. The focus is on recycling plastics from end-of-life computers. What motivated you to study the environmental impact of electronic waste and how to recycle the parts instead of just throwing them out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for, like, harkening back to my PhD dissertation. I don't think many people have ever read it, so at least you've seen it, so I appreciate that.
I
It's
tried. It's
okay.
it's paywalled. I usually
Ah,
I can't say that I've read everybody's PhD thesis that's come on because they're usually 200 plus pages, but I will skim through it. But I have a broad understanding of what you did at least.
okay, well, I'll share a copy with you afterwards.
Awesome.
No one has ever asked for one, so you may be the first. Well, I think, what motivated me to study that particular problem, it really relates to how I went to graduate school in the first place. So, after my undergraduate degree, I thought I was interested in research. As you mentioned, I went to get a master's. By then, I wasn't quite sure if research was for me, so I decided to go out into the real world and work as a designer. So I worked for 3.5 years at Caterpillar back in the Midwest, which is where I'm from. And it was a wonderful job for an engineer. I got to design metal components for large mining equipment. I got to work with suppliers who would manufacture those components. I got to go down to the production line and test how they would be assembled with, UAW colleagues. I got to follow the parts out into the field to see if they would fail or not. So as an engineer, it was a really great experience. But I've also had a longstanding interest in environmental problems. So I love hiking. I love being outdoors. And, I'll date myself here. This is the late 1990s, and back then there weren't really any jobs that were fell under the banner of sustainable engineering, right? Where a designer could make choices that would affect recycling or the embodied footprint of the materials. It was just a gap, and most companies didn't have the know-how. There wasn't a lot of demand. So I decided that I would go back to graduate school because that's where a lot of the action was happening. It was in research. There were green design groups at a few universities, and I was lucky enough to land at UC Berkeley, where there was a green design and manufacturing group. But my goal was to learn how to be a green designer, and then to go probably right back into industry and maybe work in corporate R&D. But what I found was that the research aspects, like understanding what's possible as a designer, was really interesting. So, because I really wanted to solve practical problems, like how do we make better choices as designers, I had a few co ops and internships while I was in grad school. And one of the big topics in design back in the early 2000s was how do we make computers more recyclable? And that's because in Europe, there were emerging regulations around take back of computers. So manufacturers had to facilitate the take back and recycling of computers sold into the European Union. There
In
were other
the
laws,
early 2000s.
early
Okay.
2000s. Yeah. So this was the WEEE directive, waste to WEEE. You can Google it and kind of go back and see the early days of regulation around product design. So that was motivating a lot of electronics manufacturers to think about how could they design their computers or electronic devices to be more recyclable. And plastics was a real problem spot because plastics, as we don't do a great job of recycling commodity plastics like PET soda bottles or HDPE milk bottles. But the plastics in electronics are engineering thermoplastics, which are highly, engineered, and there aren't recycling techniques for them. So I wanted to look into what could designers do in the present day by way of choosing better plastics, by way of choosing combinations of plastics, by doing things like avoiding, molded in metals for fastening plastics together, which would hamper recycling. What would that set of rules look like? And how could we simulate the effects of choosing certain designs today for plastics and what that would mean for recycling them tomorrow? So that's how I came to that particular topic. It was a combination of I wanted to do something applied. There was a lot of regulation occurring around the world, particularly in Europe, forcing manufacturers to make greener design decisions. And there were no tools yet available for designers to kind of simulate what if I choose plastic A, B, or C. And that doing that research is really what motivated me to stay in research because you can't always do that kind of forward-looking, theoretical research in a corporate context where, understandably, you've got to produce something that you can sell.
Yeah. Well, what's curious about for me when it comes to recycling, because I always think about markets, is the design seems important, but also the underlying commodities used to design whatever widget you're creating is probably important. because I'm going off of memory here, but I know when some commodity prices rise, then the recycling makes more sense because, hey, I can get money for this. So did you ever look at that aspect as well when it came to the markets?
I did. So we considered not only sort of the environmental footprint of the type of plastic one could choose as a designer, and also sort of the technical compatibility of different plastics for contaminating each other versus being compatible, but also the potential future price, which is often tied to the price of oil, the price of natural gas, and demand for recycled plastics versus virgin plastics. So yes, the sort of forward-looking analysis I did for my PhD research, which always takes a few years, right? So it had to be pretty sophisticated and all that, did take into effect future potential prices of plastics, commodity plastics versus recycled plastics, so that we could have some idea of if you choose plastic A or plastic B, what would be the economic likelihood that it would be recycled, in addition to making sure it's technically recyclable.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I was curious, for the research you did, which countries collected and recycled electronic waste at the highest rate? So many European countries had higher recycling rates, and the rate is calculated by taking the e-waste collected divided by the e-waste generated for a country in a given year. And the we directive makes sense in terms of, I assume the US probably wasn't regulating at that point, but what other factors motivated the Europeans to recycle at a higher rate? And let me just throw out some recycling numbers. Hungary had a recycling rate of around 68% in 2022, Finland 66%, Luxembourg 63%, while the global e-waste recycling rate was only about 22% in 2022.
Well, Europe is the shining example because they've been doing it so long, and it really depends on a few factors. So you have to have the infrastructure in place to take back the electronics and then disassemble them and recycle them. You have to have an easy way for consumers to return that e-waste at no cost to them. And you have to have producers who are motivated, electronics manufacturers who are motivated to set up those systems to design their products in a way where they're more recyclable and that the costs of recycling are minimal because they're going to take the hit for it, right? So that pretty much all came together in Europe in the early days with the WE directive. I've seen other initiatives in Japan, a few other countries, but we don't really have that in the United States. It doesn't mean that some manufacturers, I'll just name one, Apple has been a real leader in taking back and recycling and remanufacturing their products, but they have to do it a bit more voluntarily by investing in, the reverse supply chains to get those products back, to disassemble them, to harvest the parts they can still reuse, to recycle the rest. It's been mostly voluntary in the United States. And I think that's where you see this kind of bifurcation in those official statistics. The countries or regions that have strong regulations where producers have to pay for take back, they have to set up the systems, and it incentivizes them to make sure their products are more recyclable because they have to deal with them. That's where you see the high rates versus the low rates are typically in countries where it's voluntary, or maybe there are just, landfill bans, but no further regulation for, recycling targets for electronic materials.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'd be we'll talk about this later, but one of the black boxes in data is China. But given that they're the global manufacturing leader by a long what bit, I'd be curious if that's a conversation that's coming up there.
It might be. I'm not current on what the policies are there. I will say though that even though China manufactures a lot of components, of course, a lot of original products as well, a lot of the major electronic designers like Dell or Apple or HP, they're sitting outside of China and they're the ones that have the ability to design the overall system, whether it's a server or a laptop or a monitor, with, of course, a lot of components being made in China. They figure out the designs to bring everything together, and there's a lot of power in that process to make sure you're choosing materials and designing your devices so that they can be recycled.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let us move into data centers. this is an area that you have a lot of expertise in. Can we start at a very high level and explain what a data center is?
Sure. There's the wonky technical answer that a data center is, a building full of racks of servers and storage devices. I don't find that particularly helpful for someone who's not quite sure what a data center is. So when I explain it to my students, I take them back to the very early days of the internet. And of course, they're all much younger than that. But you can imagine way back in the first days of the internet, or it was essentially a network that connected computers, right? So you might have a computer, I would have a computer, and you would send me a file if I requested it from you, that sort of thing, right? So a lot of information sharing was happening in a distributed way across all the computers that were connected. You can imagine that pretty quickly, all internet users, but particularly, tech companies realized it would be better to have centralized locations for files, for example, so that, if you want a file and I want a file, we could go to we could send the request to a centralized computer and get it 24/7, right? So that's kind of what data centers do. They're a centralized resource on the internet that contains very specialized computers, which we call servers. And, that's where you find websites being hosted. That's where you're finding, Zoom, which is hosting the podcast right now, right? Is sitting at on a server in a data center somewhere. So, the centralization of those services is really the essence of why we have data centers. But within a data center, we have not only those servers, which are the specialized computers that do pretty much all of the heavy lifting for anything we get from the internet. You also have lots of storage devices that are storing, streaming videos or bank records or whatever. Those are the hard disks or the solid state disks. And then you have lots of network switches, which are routing the communications from the data center to you and me, but also between data centers and even between racks in a data center. So the data center is a building that has the racks of all that IT equipment that facilitates everything we do and get from the internet. But a data center also has what we call infrastructure equipment, which is primarily there to make sure that the power is always continuous. So think battery banks that in case there's a blackout or something, the racks will see continuous power. But there's also cooling systems, and we need cooling of IT racks because, if you've ever been working on your laptop, especially like on a warm summer day, you notice your legs get hot, right? And that's because computing equipment gives off heat, and that heat needs to be removed so that the servers, the storage devices, the network switches that run the internet don't overheat. Because if they do, they'll either fail or, best case, their lifespan will be diminished. So we have large cooling systems that are also part of the data center building. But that's essentially what a data center is.
Yeah, I like thinking of a data center as a file system. That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned all of this different equipment that comes in, but can we also go through the stakeholders of a data center? So I assume this can be a bit complex because the ownership can vary. You can have something like an investment fund that owns it, or maybe the hyperscaler owns it. You have utility companies that provide energy to a data center. You're also having scenarios where the hyperscalers, if they own the building, they're building out their own energy supply, something like a turbine. And then you have the facilities management. So you mentioned the cooling that goes through, that you need other perhaps companies or people to come in. They might not be directly employed by the hyperscalers or even the data center itself. So I'm kind of curious what you've seen in terms of the average, if there is such a thing, stakeholder structure for these data centers.
Sure. Well, you just named a whole bunch of them, Adrian. That was quite good, right? Someone's got to build the data center, and that's usually a hyper and run the data center, let's say, and that's usually the data center owner, and that could be a large tech company. There are also companies that are retail data center providers. They build the data center, and then they host the IT equipment from a range of customers who don't want to build their own data centers. These are called co-location or retail data centers. You have to have a lot of equipment manufacturers who make the chillers and the uninterruptible power supplies and the transformers. Think like companies like Schneider or Carrier or others who make all of that equipment. You've got to have the expertise of running it, right? So that's mechanical engineers who are dealing with HVAC, clearly a lot of computer science and computer engineers who are running the IT racks. You've got security people around the data center. You've got cybersecurity stakeholders. But then, of course, you have the customers, right? So customers are key stakeholders. Now, you worked in finance, and if you are doing trading or something, your data center provider can't even have a nanosecond of downtime. Otherwise, you're gonna miss a trade, right? But we also can't forget about the communities that are around the data centers, because now that data centers are getting quite large and they're proliferating all over the US and all over the world due to the AI boom, essentially, communities that once really didn't know much about data centers, unless you lived in Northern Virginia or a few of the hotspots.
I did at
Um,
one point, and
yeah.
yeah.
So you're probably one of the rare individuals before AI who knew what a data center was and who had seen a whole bunch of them, right? But now with the so-called AI boom, we're building many more data centers and they're much larger. Communities are becoming concerned about not only what it's going to do for their power prices, but local water resources. On-site generation, you mentioned. With on-site generation, now there are local pollution considerations that communities are worried about, because if a data center is now installing on-site power generation, either from natural gas or diesel, suddenly there are more local air pollutants from on-site generation in the neighborhood than they had before. And then, of course, government is a huge stakeholder now, because AI has a lot of importance for national security, national competitiveness. So there's always been a whole bunch of stakeholders who care about data centers, who are directly have a stake in the sector. But I think it's even grown both in number and importance of stakeholders thanks to AI.
Yeah, I'll definitely bring up the surrounding communities later in the discussion, because that's why data centers are in the news right now. But I want to move on to a very important part of data centers, which is the compute. Historically, data centers have been central processing unit or CPU centric. So that, like you were mentioning, provides general purpose computing, workloads like databases, file services, networking, CI/CD pipelines. More recently, we've had graphical processing units or GPUs that have become important for machine learning or artificial intelligence. And we have them for both training the models as well as inference. So, roughly what proportion of a typical data center's compute is CPU based versus GPU based? If you have any data like that, I'm hoping you do, because I'm curious.
Sure. I don't. We only have data at the macro level, and I know we're planning to talk a little bit about data challenges later, but, the hyperscalers like Google and Microsoft and AWS, they in their data centers, they probably have a mixture of compute for machine learning and artificial intelligence, and then conventional computing. And you're right, there's sort of a bifurcation there. Before AI, most data centers, irrespective of how large they were, had sort of generalized computing hardware. And that would be servers with mostly CPUs and memory and onboard storage, that sort of thing. But with AI, you mentioned GPUs. There are other forms of what we call accelerators. These are specialized processors for machine learning and AI computations. So now those servers that we used to have in conventional data centers that were doing general purpose tasks have been highly specialized for machine learning and artificial intelligence. And what's doing that is the addition of accelerators, which are primarily GPUs, and the giant there is NVIDIA. But AMD has, some accelerator models. Google develops its own TPUs. So those are also accelerators for machine learning. So there are more types of accelerators. But the key for, I think, people to understand is a general purpose server will use maybe about a quarter to one half to one tenth of the power that a specialized AI or machine learning server will, thanks to the addition of all of those accelerators. So the key difference is a conventional server uses a lot less power than an AI server.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to talk about this more, and this is going to be a little bit longer for this setting up this question. I investigated the technology lifecycle management of GPUs relative to CPUs. The papers I read are linked in the description in this episode. So I focused on compute in high stress environments. A high stress compute environment is defined by a sustained duty cycle exceeding 80% utilization over continuous 24-hour periods. For GPUs, this stress is characterized by extreme thermal cycling, where temperatures fluctuate between 104 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 to 85 degrees Celsius, and power densities exceed 700 watts per chip. For CPUs, high stress involves prolonged thermal soaking at high clock speeds, which accelerates electromigration and gate oxide breakdown. These environments often lead to physical or economic obsolescence within 1 to 3 years for GPUs, 3 to 5 years for CPUs. The GPUs and CPUs themselves may not be thrown out at the end of the cycle. They may sell them off to smaller businesses or to research universities. However, this obsolescence cycle does seem quick. Is there a worry that this will end up creating e-waste and maybe an oversupply of compute, which might be great for consumers, might not be given the downside of all the e-waste that's created?
Sure. Those are two really good questions. Let me tackle the secondary market aspect first. So my view is that there will probably be markets for these high-end GPU, CPU systems that maybe are obsolete from the perspective of a really cutting-edge AI or machine learning company who needs to stay, at the frontier of what compute can do. But there are many university campuses and labs that either can't afford or can't get their hands on some of this really high-powered compute. And a lot of smaller machine learning models, which are being developed in research labs or specific applications, can do perfectly well on previous generation AI computing hardware. So I do think, just given the sort of gold rush or arms race, however you want to look at it, of building out cutting-edge AI data centers and all the hardware that's coming in to feed that boom, once those devices, those servers, those GPUs, those CPUs kind of outlive their economic life at the leading edge data centers, there probably will be secondary markets across the economy for all the other applications of machine learning that we have out there, which is many more than just generative AI, essentially. E-waste. This is a topic that hasn't really been studied well for any type of data centers, let alone AI. But there's a growing movement to better analyze and understand what artificial intelligence, machine learning, investing in all of these data centers will mean from an e-waste perspective. So I have seen a few papers that are starting to put some rough numbers on what the potential e-waste implications may be. The numbers are, frankly, still somewhat small, just compared to general purpose servers, compared to general e-waste. Think of billions of smartphones in the world and hundreds of millions of laptops and monitors and so forth. So it is a problem that the analyst community is starting to take a close look at. We're starting to get some numbers. They currently seem somewhat small, partly due to because we think there's going to be a lot of secondary reuse for a while of all this sophisticated and very expensive equipment. But that doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels and not really watch the problem. But for now, I think there will be secondary markets, and that e-waste is small enough where, with the right incentives, with the right responsibility among data center operators and corporate actors, the right regulations potentially for take back, we can potentially nip the e-waste problem in the bud for AI.
Yeah, for secondary use, I don't know if you yourself are a gamer, I assume a good amount of your students are, but for the longest time, I was buying secondhand GPUs because you use those for video games besides AI. So I as a consumer that does play video games, I'm hoping that I'll definitely help out, and I'll say I'm a good Samaritan by buying secondhand GPUs.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. I'm glad it enables you to game as well. I did forget to mention, though, the conventional servers. We can't forget about those. There are tens of millions of those installed in the world. What's interesting is that we've seen really great performance and efficiency gains over the last several decades for conventional servers. It used to be that the major data center operators would replace their conventional servers every 3 to 4 years because the efficiency and computing gains that they'd see in the next generation were so great that there was a motivation for them to replace conventional servers every 3 to 4 years. What I've seen and read and heard anecdotally from data center operators is that Conventional servers are now so good at doing conventional tasks like hosting websites or facilitating Zoom calls or storing databases, whatever, that they're now replacing those over longer time spans. So where they used to replace them every 3 to 4 years, now they're lasting 5, 6, 7 years, just because the compute is so good that there's not really a motivation to replace it with the next greatest conventional server.
Yeah, that makes sense because if you have a web server and if we go back a decade, maybe longer, you're on your phone, go to a website, it takes a second to load. Now it's gone down to a nanosecond to load, getting faster than a nanosecond. The marginal benefit from that wouldn't be as great as going from a second to a nanosecond.
Sure. Yeah, the efficiency gains and the compute gains just aren't what they used to be. So that's an interesting side story, and perhaps growing e-waste issue with AI compute, but maybe the e-waste generation on conventional compute is slowing down.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. But that does tie into another question that I was thinking of. So, a comparison of GPU compute usage versus CPU compute usage is Google search to a LLM query. And maybe this is getting a little bit muddled because I know Google is adding AI to every single search now. So you get an AI response for that. And then also like even Brave browser. I don't know how many browsers you use, but Brave has its own AI that if you search, it gives you a list of options like a normal search engine would, as well as that AI query. But I think there's a few different estimates. I found a paper from the University of Rhode Island that estimates a Google search consumes about a third of a watt hour of electricity. A single short query to the ChatGPT 4.0 model from this paper, they estimated that it's about 4/10 of a watt hour. But then that's the conventional one. You also have your reasoning AI models that consumes about 2/3 of a watt hour. That's twice as much as a Google search. But you mentioned the efficiencies made in standard CPU servers. Do you think we'll get to a point where these GPU queries, whether it'll have to be a combination of hardware and software, their energy use per query will start to maybe not exactly match, but get closer to the energy used for a Google search?
I mean, it's entirely possible. One of the fascinating things about this sector and why I've been studying it for 20 years is that it changes so rapidly. So, the computing efficiency of GPUs and CPUs and or name your accelerator manufacturer has been increasing drastically every year. With every new generation, you can get more and more compute per watt of power input. But we're in a bit of a gold rush now or arms race, and what's happening is rather than those efficiencies leading to smaller data centers or fewer data centers, we're just putting more and more compute in an existing data center or a planned data center because everyone wants to be, to win the AI race, basically, whether it's generative AI or machine learning applications, and there are huge amounts of investment going into it to allow that to happen. That said, I think just given the pressures that the sector is under, so you may have heard, the interconnect queues for data centers in the US are, years, right, before a new data center can connect to an existing grid, which is why they're turning to on-site generation. There's water pressure on data centers. There are a lot of groups that are measuring the intensity or estimating the intensity, I should say, of one model versus another. And let's be honest, if they can do more with less energy and less water, provide a service to us, then it improves their economics. It potentially improves their profit margin. All of that is to say, they're motivated to improve the efficiency of every service that they provide steadily over time. So I do think that that steady pressure, and especially given the fact that it's so expensive and hard to build data centers, they're going to watch every watt, every liter of water, that sort of thing, so that their models become more and more efficient. The other factor you mentioned is it's not just a hardware problem, it's also a software issue, right? So I think there's a lot of learning by doing. It's still kind of early days for a lot of these models, and they're learning how to train models with fewer parameters. to use algorithms that are much more efficient, that sort of thing. So both the software gains and the hardware gains and the economic pressures and the pressures of not being able to find enough power or water, I think all of those are really going to force the industry to become a lot more efficient. And it's possible that you could see some kind of parity. The last thing I'll say is it's really tough to do those calculations. And the groups that are trying to make those estimates, I applaud their efforts. Those are heroic efforts. But when I try to explain, for example, to my students here at UCSB, how do we know what the energy and water footprint is of one chat GPT query, for example, right? Everyone wants to know that number, but it's kind of hard to compute. And the reason is, imagine the analogy I use is a bus. So imagine, a bus is something that can have a lot of passengers on it, right? So if you wanted to calculate the carbon emissions of riding a bus for your own personal use, right? If you were traveling, in the middle of rush hour and there are 100 people packed on that bus, your share of it, one passenger would have a pretty small carbon footprint from riding that bus. Now, if you're riding it after your third shift, coming home at 3 a.m. and you're the only person on that bus, the emissions are divided by you and the bus driver, right? So like, how do we allocate the emissions from a big system like the data centers and the servers that are out there, which have trained all the AI models and are inferencing them? Take that whole system and apportion it to sort of one query. It involves a lot of assumptions about, the impacts of the whole system and how they're assigned to any individual query or application, which is only one part of that system. And, to make it even more complicated, using that bus analogy, next year that bus might be electric or running on hydrogen. It might be more efficient. Maybe they figure out a way to pack more people on it. So it's a bit of a moving target to try to come up with the energy, the carbon, the water footprint of one query. And by the time we do it, just based on, availability of data, often it can be obsolete. So the folks who are at the cutting edge, I keep up the good work and try to do that. I just want to communicate that it can be very complicated.
Yeah, no, that is a very interesting problem to try to figure out what that underlying cost is in terms of energy. So shifting back to the specifically communities around data centers. So it's become a politically hot topic in 2025 and 2026. So once I start seeing it outside of things like the Wall Street Journal and just, I don't know, I don't really have social media, but I guess when people outside of tech talk to me about it, or finance, I know data centers are really in the zeitgeist. But there's been a range of suggested solutions. Everything from a proposed national moratorium, meaning complete suspension of building data centers within the US, to just more regulation in general. I want to talk about some of the issues people have brought up. So you mentioned water, but before we get, or I guess we can kind of lump this in. I know this will vary by region, state, locality, but have data centers made electricity more expensive for consumers? Is there direct data to support this? Or is it kind of like back to the compute problem where measuring a single query, even at a local or state level, can we really know that data centers are causing this rise in electricity prices?
Yeah, it's a great question. A very timely one too. So I'm not an economist, and most of my research focuses on the energy requirements of data centers, the water requirements, and other resource requirements. And I generally work with people who model the grid to sort of make sense of what those estimates mean for broader grid systems. I will say, I've heard about it just like you have, and I do follow the literature. I've seen some studies that do correlate data centers and capacity investments for data centers with higher electricity prices for ratepayers. I've seen studies that suggest that that relationship isn't so strong, as you mentioned, it depends on the grid, the utility, the location, how new capacity investments and new investments in grid technologies are assigned to different ratepayers, and that also often has to do with like the rate making authority that is part of the local government structure, that sort of thing. So
And
there are a lot of moving
these are,
parts.
at least within the United States, I'd assume lots of Europe, Asia, name your continent, it's very similar where you have a utility that's a monopoly in a state or maybe a region, and they set these rates or prices for things like electricity.
Well, so I'm mostly talking about the United States, but there's usually a utilities commission in some states. So in California, we have the California Public Utilities Commission, California Energy Commission as well. So these are government entities that have authority over how rates are set as well. Working with and sitting over utilities, whether there's one or multiple. So it's this complex mix of factors. And that's why you'll see studies that say yes, and maybe there's concrete evidence that yes, electricity rates have gone up, and or maybe there's concrete evidence that no, rates haven't gone up. And now we throw into the mix just yesterday, I think there was the data center pledge by most of the major data center operators with the federal administration here in the U.S., where large companies are saying they're going to pay their own way, and that ratepayers won't see an increase. So, like every other issue with this sector, it's really hard to have, firm, absolute answers that never change just because it's evolving so quickly. But if that pledge does work out and there are no effects for ratepayers, perhaps because they'll have on-site generation and maybe even sell electricity back to the grid, who knows? It could be that due to this pledge in the US and all the heat that the companies are getting from local communities, they will pay their own way. Now it remains to be seen how they'll do that and what particular costs will be covered. So, it's one of these questions that's hard to answer, and the answer is it depends usually, but it's a complex moving space that we're going to have to watch closely, and it certainly is a real concern.
Yeah, it's really interesting because at the end of the day, energy consumption is human centric. Like
Yeah.
without us, there's not energy consumption. And I always bring, well, not always, but this comes up often on this podcast is when it comes to anything human centric related, finance, sociology, things like that, it becomes such a complex problem because humans are so complex. And kind of going back to your material sciences, I always tell people in the hard sciences, it's actually easier to do material sciences relative to something that's human centric because humans are just complex.
I agree. Maybe that's what drew me to engineering is there's usually one right answer.
Yeah, that's actually what drew me or pushed me away from finance. It was too complex and everything I was doing is not making sense. But sorry, let me stop on that tangent. But let's go back to the water issue. So you mentioned that GPUs, CPUs, they get very hot. To cool them, water needs to be used at the server or rack level. The water usage is a concern for people in these localities. So Meta, the owner of Facebook, is proposing expanding the existing facility in Los Lunas in New Mexico, which also borders Texas. So in the southwest of the United States, water scarcity is an issue. Should residents be worried about having access to water given all this build out, or is this concern potentially overstated?
Well, I think the answer to the first part is quite easy. I think communities should always have a voice in how their resources are used, and they have a right to be concerned about the potential water use or power use of data centers, the emissions coming from data centers, what that will do to local utility prices, all of those things they should be concerned about and have a voice in when potentially a new data center is coming to town. Now, whether water specifically will be a major issue is a function of a few things. The big one is the design of the data center. The second is like the local climate. And let's unpack those two things. And then third, I should say, is the local water stress, right? Is water available? Is it already stressed? Was it likely to be stressed? Those are things that have to be considered. You mentioned that the removal of heat requires water. Um, that's partly true. So if we step back to, the fact that racks generate heat that are full of IT equipment and that heat needs to be removed, in conventional data centers, that heat was typically removed by air, not using liquid at the level of the server or even the components within a server, because just like air conditioning at home, You could blow cold air in the front of the rack and it would pick up the heat from the conventional servers or other devices. It would come out warm. And so that's known as air cooling. That removes the heat from the rack, but now you've got warm air. The warm air is generally then cooled back down and recirculated back to the racks once it's cold again by using a water chiller. So that's where water comes in at a typical data center site. But that's a closed loop of water. Its job is to cool down that warm air that comes out of the rack to make it cold enough again to go back in the front. But when the chiller does that, now it's got warm water to deal with, and it has to take that heat and reject it from the building, from the data center building. This is where consumptive water use comes in. So what do I mean by consumptive water use? It's water that's taken into a data center that isn't put right back into the water system. It's evaporated and it goes somewhere else, basically. So the way a lot of conventional data centers would reject that heat from the warm water was they would use cooling towers. And you may have seen those back in Northern Virginia, on top or next to data centers, and the steam coming off of them. That's water vapor. And that's basically the chiller removing the heat from the data center in the same way that sweat removes heat from our bodies. So if a data center is using air cooling with an evaporative heat rejection method, then it can consume lots of water. However, that's not the only way to do it. You mentioned water cooling of racks. So that's a new paradigm that is frankly being accelerated due to AI. The reason is a rack of AI servers will consume a lot more power than a rack of conventional servers, up to 10 times more power. You can't remove all that heat quickly enough just by blowing cold air through the server. And that's where we're seeing a shift to liquid cooling. So what's liquid cooling? Instead of using air, you run cool water to the components within the server. That water then becomes warm and you can reject it from the data center. So that's what we call liquid cooling. It's direct to the components. However, one of the big breakthroughs that's happening right now is we used to run, air-cooled racks at, 75, 80C, 70C, reasonably cool air. With the latest generation of AI computing equipment, the most recent one coming out of NVIDIA, right? So they announced that you can now cool the Vera Rubin rack, which will be coming out, I think, later this year or early next year, with 45C inlet water. 45C is like 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So they said now you can cool our racks using hot inlet water. So rather than cold air coming into the rack, you can have 45C, which is pretty hot. It'll remove the heat from the rack and it'll come out at 50 or 60C. Suddenly you've got really hot water, and it's possible to simply take 50 or 60C water, which is really hot, and reject it to the outside environment using what's known as a dry cooler, essentially like a fan and a radiator like you have in your car. As long as you can bring the water back down to 45C, meaning as long as it's cooler than 45C outside your data center, which it is in most parts of the world and most parts of the year, suddenly you don't need to evaporate water to cool the AI racks. So if you're using that design, there may still be some air cooling of non-AI racks. There might be some water used for humidification and other uses. Suddenly now you can have a large data center that doesn't require a lot of water. So it's the design, the climate, as I mentioned, plays a role. If it's cold outside, dry coolers work perfectly well. And then, of course, whether you have enough water to begin with. So if a data center wants to come to town and they've got all the other factors there, except there's not enough water and there's regulations or there's community opposition, they probably won't install evaporative cooling systems, right? But that pushback might be necessary to push them to go to more dry cooling configurations.
Yeah, that pivots to what I want to talk about next when in terms of water stress. So I've been very interested in the location of data centers. We mentioned Northern Virginia, and there's a lot of reasons why there's a lot of data centers there, including the federal government. But in one of my previous podcasts, I mentioned how data centers are built in Texas and Arizona, where it's very hot compared to a lot of the rest of the US. For example, North or South Dakota. So what I didn't mention is that the energy that comes from Texas is the largest oil producer. It's also the largest refiner. So that's a big factor. But if we look at, I don't know if it's North or South Dakota, North Dakota is also a large producer of energy, but as of 2025, the last data I saw, North Dakota had only 22 data centers, while Texas had 413. So it could also be a variety of factors. Texas is known as being generally light regulation when it comes to things such as building. But why would more data center builders, whether it's the hyperscalers or somebody else, not build more in North Dakota relative to Texas? Like, what are the pushes and pulls for that?
It's a great question. I think we have to answer it like from two perspectives: before AI and after AI. So before AI, conventional data centers, what drove their siting? It was usually things like, of course, tax incentives, right? So a lot of jurisdictions want data centers or other businesses to come, so they would provide incentives in the form of tax breaks or faster permitting, that sort of thing for data centers to be built. Data centers typically are located next to large population centers, or at least reasonably close, due to latency requirements. So when you're trading stocks, you don't want to have a lot of delays on the network between, you're pressing the button to buy a stock and the computation being executed at the data center. So latency.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Have you read Flash Boys?
I haven't known.
Oh no, no. Do you know Michael Lewis? Man, I hope I'm getting his name right. Big Short.
I
Man.
I I remember the story. Yeah.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry. Just because going back to finance, I lived in Philly, spent a lot of time in Jersey and New York. So the talk of latency was very big when I was in finance. I'm sorry for interrupting, though.
Sure. No, no, that's a perfect example as well of why you want to reduce latency. The other things we want to reduce latency for are like streaming video, or especially if you're controlling autonomous fleets of vehicles, that kind of thing. You want to have very minimal delays in communications. But of course, things like the land price, could you get enough power? Was the climate a good one for minimizing your cooling energy use? Was there water if you need evaporative cooling and so forth? So these are the things that have always driven siting, but with the real push now to build as many data centers and as quickly as we can in the US to meet the growing demand for AI compute, suddenly some of those factors are kind of rising to the top. One of them is incentives, right? So Texas, as you mentioned, has perhaps lower stringency in terms of regulations than a place like California or maybe Virginia. So they're incentivizing data centers to come. Can the data centers get enough power and quickly, either by just the sheer availability of it, or through permitting, or both? Right. That's another factor. Is there enough water? Is it going to be a bottleneck suddenly because now that we have these very large data centers? So just to give you a sense of scale, a large conventional data center, 10 years ago would have been around 100 megawatts. That was a really large conventional data center. Now, an AI data center campus is 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatts. So, a 1 gigawatt data center campus for AI is 10 times the size of the previous largest data centers that you'd find anywhere on the planet. So, it is really a big step change. Now, even if you have low water requirements, just because the data center is so large, you're going to still need a lot of water, right? Even if the water per unit compute is quite low. So things like that, finding, people that can build it quickly enough, that can staff it. So these are the siting considerations that are driving investments today. And the reason, North Dakota perhaps wasn't a data center hub in the past was due to all those factors I mentioned in the pre-AI days. With the push to build as many and as large and as quickly as possible, right? Now suddenly Texas is emerging as a huge hub thanks to the incentives and the availability of power and fast permitting and all that. That's why you're seeing suddenly a shift in where data centers are being built. And I don't know about North Dakota where they sit presently, but if they have some of those factors align with what data centers need today to build quickly, perhaps they'll grow. But we need to think about a new paradigm of siting constraints or siting incentives, because for AI data centers, they're kind of rewriting the rule book.
Yeah, they're kind of just because I started thinking about latency. Have you seen maybe if a hyperscaler, so for example, if Google is looking to train a model, they have a dedicated facility just for training. since they're training the model, they don't need to worry as much as latency. Then you have something called inference. That's when somebody puts in a query and you would want to get a answer back relatively quickly. Have you seen the locations kind of broken up where, okay, there's not a lot of people that live in North or South Dakota, but I'm not worried about latency. So let me set up a training data center there.
Yeah. So it's hard to know because we don't have insights into like what's happening in specific Google data centers or AWS or Microsoft data centers. But in theory, you're right. So the two parts of a large AI model, the first is training the model, which requires lots and lots of compute, but there isn't a latency issue with that in general because, you're training the model. So you could in theory put those operations in a data center in the middle of nowhere because it's cool, you've got a sufficient power, sufficient water, whatever. Inference is when we use the models. That's where you're getting sort of an email summary, whether you like it or not, in your Gmail, right, or wherever app you use, or you're running a ChatGTP query. That's where we're using the models for a real time answer, depending on what kind of answers we need. Like if I'm just getting help organizing a file or something, I don't mind if there's latency. But if you're using inferencing to control autonomous vehicles or robots or something, there's got to be very minimal latency, meaning those inferencing computations have to occur close to population centers. So it's not clear as an industry outsider if there are dedicated training centers and dedicated inference centers. But what I understand anecdotally is that, the equipment is very expensive. They're using it at full capacity for both training and inference. They're kind of dual purpose that way. And so I don't think you're going to find dedicated training data centers and dedicated inferencing data centers. I mean, I should say, sorry, you'll find dedicated inferencing at the edge close to population centers, but I don't know if you'll find dedicated training centers that only do training just because, if you've trained a model, you've invested billions in that compute capacity, you still need GPUs and other accelerators to do inferencing. You're probably going to use it for that too, just for lower latency inferencing applications.
Yeah. Uh, well, we'll talk more about data soon and the issues with that. But I do kind of on the sustainability front want to highlight a data center or centers that Google built in Hamina, Finland. So in 2009, Google bought an old paper mill in the town in Finland, as well as surrounding land. By 2011, they built their first data center there. What's interesting about the data center is how they repurpose parts of the paper mill. So Google upgraded the piping and they used seawater from the Gulf of Finland, which was once used to cool the paper mill's turbines, but now it cools the data center. Google then they repurpose the heat, so it goes actually to the people in the town. They get free heat from the data center. They even have a sauna within the mill that is heated by the data center. So I think this is a novel example of how to. I don't. You would know better than me or myself if this would be counted as sustainable. But do you think that hyperscalers, data center builders have to kind of be creative when it comes to building the data centers and think about use cases like Hamina?
I do, and I think now that there's a lot more scrutiny, that there's a lot more, there are more eyes on them for making those decisions. Now, the case you mentioned is, I would say, absolutely, if you can use a water body for once through cooling, like you would use at a power plant or a paper mill, you can certainly lower drastically the energy requirements and water requirements of cooling the data center. And if you can reuse the waste heat, all that heat that comes off the racks that otherwise you just have to reject into the atmosphere, if you can reuse that for a beneficial purpose, like plugging it into a district heating system, what does that do? Well, now the heat that goes to the homes and the surrounding communities is coming from waste heat that you would otherwise just vent. And you don't have to use a natural gas plant or some other form of, combustion-based heating for district heating. You replace it basically. So there's environmental benefit there. So I think those sort of design opportunities are going to be even more important for these new, very large data centers. And the big thing that they need to worry about, I know now, is how are they going to power that data center, that 1 gigawatt campus, in a sustainable way. So I do think there'll be more scrutiny. I do think there needs to be more transparency about how the data center is being designed. I think there needs to be more awareness of what those options are and how they might vary. So unfortunately, in the US, we have very little district heating. You find some district heating in some of the older cities out east, but it's fairly limited. Or you might find some district heating on university campuses or hospital campuses. But for most data centers in the US, you can't just plug into a district heating system. And even if you can, you only need heating for part of the year. So what happens to that waste heat when you don't need heating, right? So the crazy thing that I'm witnessing now with the rapid growth in AI data centers and the shift to liquid cooling and maybe cooling them at much hotter temperatures is suddenly now there's lots and lots of waste heat that could be captured and utilized for things like district heating if they're in the right location. Or you can take that heat and you can run an absorption or absorption chiller and create, you know, cool water to cool your chillers on site. You might be able to, export that heat to a local factory. There are suddenly a lot of things we can do with that heat because there's so much of it now. And there's an economic potential case for sending that heat elsewhere. It's just, it'll depend on where the data centers are located and what's located around them.
Yeah, I'd be curious the manufacturing use case, if there'd be a way to do it, or if it would be more, unfortunately, one-off situations where it just happens to align where I could build the data center here and there's a manufacturing industrial plant that lines up. So
Yeah. In the short term, it's going to be one off. In the longer term, the concept of eco-industrial parks has been around for ages. You find them here and there around the world, but you'd have to sort of co-develop and build this synergistic network from the ground up, and that'll take a lot more time.
yeah, as with a lot of this, it'll be interesting to look back 10 years from now. So I finally want to move to the data of data centers. So we need data from data centers. We've talked a lot about the heat generated by that. Having that data is very important. But I've watched a lot of your presentations at this point. Something that you highlight is that the data collection is not that great. And unfortunately, at this point, data on data centers is very sparse. So why has it been hard to get data on data centers? And has data collection gotten improved over time? Because a lot of your videos are from 2020 at this point. It's about 5-6 years ago. Have we made an improvement since 2020?
So I'll let me say it's getting a little better, but let me start with the history. So it's not as bad as it used to be. So why don't we have good data on the data center sector? Let me define what I mean by good data. It would mean that we understand what the energy and water use and power sources are for individual data center sites. So we have some idea of what's happening at the local scales where communities are impacted, right? And if you combine all those up, of course, then you can understand what's happening at the regional scale, the level of a state, the level of the country. One of the reasons we don't have good data is because for a long time, frankly, before the AI boom, data centers represented, a non-trivial amount of power use here in the US, even around the world. Maybe data centers were 1% of national electricity use, maybe 2%, somewhere in that zone. So they weren't a major national issue like they are now. That's changed with the AI boom. Now, suddenly, data centers in the US have grown from 1 or 2% in the 2010s to around 4% as of a couple of years ago, and they're projected to rise up to 6 to 12% by 2028. So suddenly now that they're placing such stress on the grid, they become relevant. But the reason we didn't have great data is because they were sort of a niche topic for a long time until the AI boom. The other factor is the tech industry is generally very guarded about their data, meaning they don't report a lot of data unless they have to. So there's always been voluntary reporting from all the big players, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Meta, and so forth. But it'll come out in their annual reports. They might report how much electricity their entire company uses, but not tell you about their data centers. Some companies may tell you about their data centers, but as a whole fleet and not individual data centers. Because it's been voluntary, and there's still no reporting requirement in the US for data center operators to report those data. We are seeing policies that are being proposed around the country to sort of force their hand, but that's kind of why we don't have the data we need. It's partly historical, because they were small and the boom is fairly recent, and partly because they're very guarded about what they share because they're worried about revealing trade secrets or proprietary information and that sort of thing. And the last piece is people like me who kind of run the numbers to understand what are the impacts of data centers, both historically and today, where might they be going? We need to have a sense of what's happening on the ground today. But in most data center builds that are either underway or planned, are subject to NDAs, non disclosure agreements. That means if a company's building a new data center site in, who knows, Nebraska or North Dakota, analysts and the public might not have any idea of how large it's going to be. How much water will they need? How much power will they need? Where will they get their power? How efficient will they be? Those details, the company knows, maybe the local authorities know, but the public, which includes analysts like me, we don't know because they're subject to NDAs and they're not revealed. And that I find is a big blind spot for analysts today because the sector is changing so rapidly. We should ideally know what's happening on the ground so that we can better analyze and model it and make better projections. But those key sources of data are often hidden from us due to NDAs. So that's kind of why we don't have good data in a nutshell.
So I am curious. So when you're mentioning analysts, I assume that you're maybe talking about yourself. So researchers at universities, or maybe financial analysts somewhere, Morgan Stanley, that needs to crunch numbers for utilities. I assume that there's also internal analysts. So, for example, I believe one of the data center operators or owners is Equinix, and but I would have to assume that they do collect the data. Or have you talked to them? Where like NDA, so they may not have to share it, but hopefully they at least have some data, right?
Oh, they all the operators and the builders that they have the data. There's no doubt about that because utilities are a key cost driver and design, they've got to design and run these facilities. And there are some companies that are better than others at reporting. You mentioned like the analyst community. It used to be back when data centers were a fairly niche topic. So I started on this 20 years ago when I got, I was a young researcher at Lawrence Berkeley Lab and Congress commissioned a study of US data centers. It got sort of, commissioned at Berkeley Lab, and I was invited to help lead it. And I didn't know anything about data centers back then. And, there were only a few of us, frankly, in the country of the world who actually studied data centers. That has changed drastically, and then that's a good thing. So analysts in the private sector at banks and investment firms, at consulting firms are now making estimates about the power water use of data centers. Government agencies, Department of Energy and others have analysts who are studying this sector. Researchers like me, there are a lot more of us now who are studying the sector. When I said the data is getting better, it's because partly companies are starting to open up a little bit and publishing a bit more, releasing a bit more. NDAs aside, because of all the public pressure. The second thing that's happening is because all the analysts are now jumping in to study this sector, there are better data from the real estate sector, for example, on the number of data centers being built in key markets. What might be the megawatt size of those data centers? So we do have a better sense of where the data centers are, what their proposed or design size may be, but we still have to make a lot of estimates about, even if we know the proposed megawatt size of a data center, how much of that will it use? What will be its PUE? What kind of cooling technologies? How much water does that mean? We still don't have those data details, even though there are collectively more data being produced. So when I say it's better, that's the reason, but it's still not as good as we need for really sort of better predictive analyses to guide decisions.
Makes sense. So you recently gave testimony to the United States Congress alongside of executives from Google. Is actually kind of funny because you were talking about data collection, they were talking about permitting reform,
Yeah.
so it kind of seems like should have been separate meeting. But anyway, so if anybody does want to listen to the testimony, it's linked in the description below on
Oh,
YouTube.
thank you.
So, in the testimony, you mentioned that the Energy Information Administration, which is a government US agency that collects data on energy, could be an ideal data collector and aggregator for data centers. Why do you think that they would be an ideal data collector? And how do you envision that this process would work?
I appreciate the shout out for the link to the testimony. My role there was to just raise awareness about the lack of data for understanding this sector. I did mention that the Energy Information Administration, or EIA, could be one of the federal agencies that would be really well suited to gather these data. The reason is any of you can go to the EIA's website and you'll see that they've collected data and made data available publicly for decades for every major energy consuming sector in the US. That includes the power sector, the building sector, the manufacturing sector. We collect data on the transport sector. So this agency, their entire remit is collecting statistics about the US energy system and making those available to policymakers, to researchers, to the public. So they know how to design surveys, they know how to gather data in a statistically valid way, they know how to protect confidential information, and they know how to disseminate it so that researchers and anyone, frankly, can use them. And that's why when I was put on the spot and asked, like, which agency could do this, they're the ones that have the longest standing history for every other major sector in doing this. So how would they do it? I kind of just described, they have to design a survey. They have to have, get the legal authority to collect the data. They have to standardize the data in a way so that they know what they're getting back from the reporters. They have to clean and normalize the data. They have to aggregate it. And then they have to release it in a way that isn't going to tell us exactly, any confidential information that any of the major companies want to protect. But that's what they've been doing for a long time. That's what they know how to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I've worked with data sets collected by the U.S. government, by U.S. government agencies. I think almost all data analysts, software engineers have. But for example, going back to my college days, I worked with data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But a potential issue that I might see with the EIA getting issued this is government bureaucracies can move a lot slower than industry. So if there's some sort of gridlock in this issue of data collection and authorizing the EIA to do this, do you think that an industry group can potentially fill this gap? So,
Sure.
for
Yeah.
example, like
Yeah.
hyperscalers like Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, and even the hardware providers like Nvidia, if you kind of look at the cash that they have on their balance sheets, this would be a fraction of that. So, and at the end of the day, if they're all funding this, I think it would help them out too. But has this ever been discussed, or is this also a potential suggestion to them?
Oh, absolutely. I think, and I and some of my colleagues who've been raising sort of the importance of better data for years have mentioned this particular model that you just summarized, right? So we don't necessarily have to wait for government. The industry itself could publish the data. And usually the way that works, and there is precedent from other sectors, by the way, I'll give one quick shout out to the cement industry. So the cement industry has long been under scrutiny for its environmental pollution and other aspects. So years ago, they decided to collectively come up with data standards and publish data on their fuel use, their production characteristics in key parts of the world, that sort of thing. But the key was having an independent third party do it. An independent third party do it. I'll repeat that. So for credibility and also to make sure that the data could be trustworthy, not biased in any way. So yes, the petroleum industry has done this through the Solomon Index. The cement industry has done it. The key is finding an independent third party where, of course, all the big players, hardware, data center operators would need to be at the table, but you'd also need to have, researchers there, nonprofits there, building consensus about how the data could be collected, what should be collected, how it should be reported, and having an independent third party be responsible for gathering the data, keeping it keeping the proprietary stuff, behind a firewall and releasing statistics that everyone would find useful. So I think it'll be a community effort, but it could certainly be initiated and supported by the industry. And I think personally, yeah, it would cost money, but the return on that investment in terms of getting better credibility with stakeholders, better data out there to support research of all types would be worth it.
Yeah, and I definitely think this is feasible. And in a way, the hyperscalers like Google, Meta, Amazon, they have people that on the software side contribute to open source packages like Python. And they have people that work for Amazon or Google, but they contribute to open source packages because everybody needs those packages, including them. So I think they can do it, and they're doing it with software. Now they kind of have to do it with real world physical data centers too. I mean, potentially. Who knows what the best option is, but
Yeah, it's not a new model. It's one that other industries have used for a long time, and I'm hoping they'll consider it.
yeah. So in your testimony, the last thing I'll mention on it is you mentioned that hardware providers can assist in data collection on energy uses. So I don't know if you yourself code, but I have my GPU workstation. I actually have too many computers in here, but my main GPU workstation is right here. I've been working, I usually do more classical machine learning models, pushing myself to do more generative AI models at this point. But something that I do personally is I look at my GPU resource utilization. So I have an NVIDIA GPU. I want to look up how much compute I'm using for a Python script or the temperature of my GPU. I use NVIDIA-SMI. That command brings up a lot of summary statistics that are useful to me. So do we already have the metrics available, or is there additional metrics that could be useful, or is it just not being collected as it should? What are your thoughts on how the hardware AMD or Nvidia suppliers can assist here?
Sure. I think the test bed that would develop power profiles for different types of applications would be fantastic. And the reason is, you can use market data to get a sense of how many NVIDIA GPUs are out there in the US market, right? And how many different types of servers, that sort of thing. The main data gap that we have is if we wanted to, an analyst like me wants to make an estimate about the sort of power profile or even average power use of a certain type of server, you can go to the manufacturer's website, and what you get is sort of the power supply rating, which is maybe even oversized for the server, and that's an extreme maximum value. But you don't really understand how much of that power will be real and how it might vary based on different applications. That's where having test beds that could take different models and run them through different types of applications, give you power profile information on GPU or CPU engagement, overall averages or peak power utilization, that kind of thing, would be a gold mine for analysts like me who don't have the resources to set up a test data center and get the data ourselves, or who don't have access to a network of operators who could provide those data. And why are they important? Well, if you think about some of the studies that, I myself have been involved in with colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, we've published now 3 US national data center energy studies. We have to make estimates about how many different servers are out there, the types, the capacities, and then how much power do they use. That would be great empirical data to make better estimates in national studies like that. But there are a lot of researchers who are looking into how could the power of AI computing be more flexible, meaning you could turn up and down workloads. You could shift them between data centers to make greater utilization of renewable energy and that sort of thing. Having those power profiles that are subject to a common standard, that are credible and rigorous, and we know that they're empirical and not just that someone made them up somewhere, would be really helpful for all sorts of research. And that's where hardware manufacturers could contribute for sure.
Okay, awesome. That's interesting to think about. So let's get to the last section of data centers. So I want to talk about the sustainability of them. I had a back to your presentations, and you even mentioned it here. It depends is a phrase that I use all the time, and like a reaction I get is an eye roll a lot of times, but that's the right answer, whether people like it or not. Can we go through a scenario analysis where we walk through the best, worst, and base case scenarios on data center sustainability?
Yeah. So the worst case, let's start there. Let me start with the best case. That's a bit easier. So
I am an optimist, so
yeah, let's start with the best case, and this is where the industry really needs to go. Is what is the purpose of a data center? Whether it's an AI data center or a conventional data center that's hosting websites or facilitating e-commerce, you want to minimize the ratio of resource inputs, whether it's power or water, and environmental outputs, whether it's global warming emissions or local air pollutants, per unit of service that the data center provides. So you've got, this conceptual ratio of impacts on top and service on the bottom. So the service on the bottom would be, the number of computations, the number of web queries, the number of model inferences you could get out of the data center. So maximizing, if you think of this as a simple ratio, put your impact of choice in the numerator. If you grow the denominator, meaning the service output you get from a data center, that's one way of reducing that ratio. So what can we do there? You can make models more efficient through better code, more efficient algorithms, training them on fewer parameters. There's a lot of learning that's going to happen there when it comes to AI. For machine learning, you don't need massive data sets. You could get by with a lot smaller models, which again would be trained on fewer data and be much more efficient. You could use the most efficient hardware possible. This means, you have the most efficient CPUs, GPUs, you're running them in the most efficient way. You're running them at high capacity utilization. So if you think back to the bus example, that bus is moving around whether there are people on it or not, right? So servers and a lot of electronic devices in data centers have a fixed load. Whether we're using them or not, they're drawing power. So we want to maximize the capacity utilization and maximize the service output so that we're using every piece of hardware to its maximum efficiency point. And there are ways that we can measure those things, right? Through existing metrics or metrics that we need to develop. So every data center is usually motivated to get as most output as it can out of its assets and therefore maximize the size of the denominator, but it's not always the case, right? So a sustainable data center would do all those things. Now let's talk about the numerator, which is, let's just take carbon emissions or air pollution emissions. We want to be running these data centers on as much renewable power, ideally 100% renewable power as we can. Therefore, the carbon, the air pollution per unit of output would be minimized. But to do that, you also need to minimize the power input to the data center. So the other things we care about are really efficient cooling systems. So the shift to liquid cooling is certainly going to make these large data centers more efficient, but because they're so large, even a little bit of cooling power use is still quite large in the aggregate, right? From a community perspective. So maximum efficiency for cooling systems, maximum efficiency for the power conditioning systems and so forth. And then water, shifting away from evaporative to dry wherever we can do it, depending on the climate and the facility design and the set points and all that. Those are things we can do to sort of minimize the numerator. And if we can minimize the numerator and maximize the denominator, what we're going to get is a data center sector that has minimal impacts per unit of useful service. So that's like the rosiest scenario for data center sustainability. And the opposite is, data centers that are running on fossil fuel generation and on-site generation that's producing a lot of local air pollutants. Are data centers that aren't optimizing their cooling systems, but rather maybe building them as quickly as they can. They're not recovering waste heat. They're using, legacy technologies that are less efficient. Now the numerator is getting quite big. And then the denominator would be if they are not maximizing the utility of their assets, which ideally they would, or working on more efficient algorithms and models. Now suddenly we've got a data center sector just because of its size. Even small changes in that ratio stack up to really large impacts from a societal perspective. That would be kind of the worst outcome. So we're somewhere in between right now.
Yeah. So the base case is, maybe you're not completely utilizing the best available hardware, and maybe you're not using the most ideal fuel source, but it's not the worst case scenario either, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, but it remains to be seen. As you said earlier, we're going to see what actually happens over the next few years in hindsight. But what we're seeing now is a lot of on-site generation that is going to be fueled by natural gas, whether they're building it themselves or whether we're putting natural gas back in the grid. Thankfully, it's not coal in most parts of the US, but there is a lot of natural gas, some diesel being used for generators that are running a lot more often now, leading to local air pollution. So we're seeing that. But it must be said that this industry, being the richest one in the world, with all the investments flowing in it, they've historically also been the largest investors in renewable energy projects and also breakthrough energy projects. What do I mean by that? Well, if a new data center has to install on-site natural gas turbines, a lot of the data center operators have net zero pledges They're also, building a wind farm in Chile, which is helping that grid become greener and lower carbon. So there's a little bit of a back and forth that we play there. The other thing that they're doing is they're really investing hard in new emerging technologies like enhanced geothermal for using geothermal energy, or nuclear fusion. They're investing in that. They're investing in small modular reactors. So at the same time that we're seeing a lot of investments in the stuff that are leading us down the wrong path, they're also investing in things that are leading other parts of the world on the right path, and maybe unlocking breakthrough technologies that, who knows, it remains to be seen, in 5 or 10 years will provide a lot cleaner power both for themselves and for other power users. And it's this complex system of moving parts that we need to watch very closely.
Yeah. No, on the energy usage itself, I think at the end of the day, like I've talked to a few people and nuclear is the hot topic. I've actually gotten to know a few nuclear engineers over the past 5, 10 years. And yes, I think that's the rosy energy scenario where we're getting France level energy generation from nuclear. But I think at the end of the day, like realistically, we have some sort of diversified mix. So I do think we would need natural gas, but ideally also geothermal. That's a really interesting technology, but that's also dependent on the location. Like I believe Utah has some geothermal that's going on there, but yeah, I think a diversification. Hopefully, nuclear works out. I think nuclear is the rosy scenario that's yet to be determined, and I've I don't know. I think people should. I think there will be some things built on the nuclear side, but I also think people need to temper their expectations a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of attention. I will say, though, we can't forget about conventional renewables, solar and wind. We're not investing in them, I think, as much as we could. They've been the strongest growth of capacity additions here in the U.S. for the past few years, which is absolutely great. But they can play a role. It's just we need to focus on building them and quickly. And I wouldn't write out geothermal, enhanced geothermal. Most parts of the country have sufficient heat. It's a matter of how far you have to drill down to get it. So, but that's what enhanced geothermal does. It utilizes fracking technology. It can go quite deep into the Earth's surface to tap into the heat. So it could be viable in many parts of the country.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. And going back to the solar panels, if you're in Texas, I kind of think solar panels or Arizona, man. I don't know how much time you've spent there. I've only been there once, but there's some brutal heat out there.
Some
uh,
brutal heat. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but sorry, let me not go on a tangent again. So, something I've been thinking about, so maybe this isn't even the worst case scenario. This is more of an apocalyptic scenario. Is I don't know what's going to happen with AI. I don't. There's been talk of an AI bubble. That talk goes up and down based on a fear index that people have. But one thing I've been thinking about is if the bubble pops with AI, what happens to the data centers? For example, in the unlikely scenario where we have a Google or Meta that goes bankrupt, what happens if we have, you've been mentioning underutilized data centers, but what if we have just completely shuttered data centers? What are the implications of that?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of talk around, are we in a bubble? When will it burst? That sort of thing. Um, I guess all I'll say is, so if there's data center capacity that's built and there's power capacity that's built, that's, not on site, but rather it's at the, or it could be on site, for example, or it could be in the grid. There's a risk of stranded assets. And anytime you have stranded assets, meaning someone has paid for billions of dollars to build up a system that doesn't produce returns, there are going to be economic losses, right? So clearly the data center operators will lose out and utilities may lose out. And if ratepayers are paying for those additions, like they're going to still keep paying for them, even though they've been mothballed or not being used at capacity, those are very real economic effects. And, if the tech companies and utilities and others who have a stake in data centers are a non-trivial part of our economy, right? That would probably ripple into all of our retirement savings accounts and stock market accounts, that sort of thing. So it wouldn't be good. Uh, and time will tell, right? Maybe some of these large data center campuses that are being built won't be built to these huge capacities that they have in mind, because those are 3 or 4 or 5 years off in the future. Maybe they'll be more modest. If there are stranded computing assets, like I said, there are probably going to be secondary markets, just because AI and machine learning aren't going away, even if a lot of the investments that are being poured in are to kind of support generative AI, which requires huge amounts of compute, right? Those assets could be redirected to research labs and universities, and for machine learning for much smaller models where that compute will be plenty powerful,
Are
right?
you looking to take over some of those?
Well, I'd love to have a cluster here where we could take, real-time measurements. We have a cluster here on my campus that's always under intense competition for, video processing and all sorts of research, but there's just not enough to go around right now. So maybe that would be one upside to that happening. But time is going to tell, right? The next 5 to 10 years are really going to reveal a lot about if the bets on new technologies are going to pay off, if these bets on AI applications are going to have business returns and be economically viable. If some of all these campuses that we hear are going to be 3, 4, 5 gigawatts, almost the size of the whole power requirements of New York or LA, will come to fruition. Time is going to tell. But there is a risk of stranded assets and all that, and there could be some economic losses that we'll have to deal with. I hope not. I hope we'll figure that out before there's a big bubble burst. But time will tell.
Yeah, I know. When I think about this scenario, I kind of think about 2008, 2009, the financial crisis then, and living through it, not being of working age, but having enough brain cells to kind of understand what's going on. And I'm worried about a bailout for Meta, Google. That's a whole different discussion, whether you should or shouldn't. I have a feeling that Meta is not as crucial as the banking system. So sorry, Meta, if you defaulted on your bonds. I guess no more Facebook, but sorry, I'm kind of going off again, but kind of. So let's put a scenario out where you're made the czar of data centers, meaning you could set any policy you want. You have a final say on how much can be built, where it could be built, what could be built. What would your policy or policies be?
Wow, that's a fun question. Let me quickly say, even if, AI, the big investments go bankrupt, the large players, Oracle, Google, they're all going to be around, because we still have a huge need for conventional data centers, which are a big, important part of all the business models of all those companies. It's just we may not see the 5 gigawatt AI campus coming to fruition. So if I could sort of wave a magic wand, I would absolutely accelerate the development. I put all hands on deck for renewables development, and development of alternative energy sources like enhanced geothermal, and battery storage at data centers, because I do think it sounds neat and tidy to say let's ban AI data centers, let's have a moratorium. But the fact of the matter is, we need AI could potentially unleash a lot of potential benefits through its applications. Imagine, solving cancer, or making transportation more efficient, or discovering new materials faster. These are some of the things that we have a lot of hope for in the scientific community around AI and machine learning. And we don't necessarily want to stop progress on those, but we do want to allow data centers to be built, and probably more quickly, with the right set of guardrails. So the guardrails I put up are having PUE and WE type standards. So PUE is a measure of cooling system power efficiency. WE is a measure of cooling system water efficiency. We know how to design even large data centers with very low PUE and WE values, meaning their cooling, water, and power efficiencies are maximized, right? Those could become, requirements for data center builds, even if they're more expensive. This is a rich sector after all, right? They can do it. I would mandate much more transparency in, not only the current operations of these major operators, but the real-time details of what's being built, and much more engagement with local communities, so that communities were empowered with the data they need to understand the implications, so that they can make the decisions that they want. And if they decide that they don't want a data center, even with full transparency, and real data, so be it, right? There are probably plenty of places around the country where they would be welcomed. I would have requirements for things like on-site storage, where renewables are growing rapidly. We need them much more quickly and many more renewables on the grid. But their intermittency means we need to have some sort of, demand response and also energy storage capabilities in the grid. Data centers, some of them are investing in battery storage, but that could be a requirement as well. Waste heat recovery, as I mentioned with AI type data centers, there's much more heat being rejected. Now suddenly it's a lot hotter and there's a lot more of it. I would mandate more waste heat recovery. If nothing else, use that waste heat on site for your own cooling needs rather than venting it to the atmosphere. But ideally, if you can co-locate with industrial facilities or communities that could use that waste heat, then it should be required of you. But these are all kind of design details that the industry holds very closely to their chest, right? They don't really reveal. So I think we need to open that up, make it a lot more transparent, put those policy measures in place, and have much greater conversations with policymakers and communities so that we can achieve that vision. And then the last thing I'll say is, if we absolutely have to build data centers, and there's not enough renewable capacity, you do all the other things that I mentioned. And if you're using on-site power, at minimum, we should require investments in parts of the US where perhaps, we can bring renewables online faster, but maybe it's not the right location for data centers, or maybe the stars don't align. Like, we need to start addressing the grid transformation elsewhere, even if in parts we have to move it in the wrong direction temporarily. And there should be long-term targets that even if you have to build with on-site generation of gas today, you've got a moratorium on how long you can use that. And by such and such a date, based on what's practical, based on what's achievable, you've got to eventually switch to a much better power source. That's what I would sort of mandate as czar as well. I'd be pretty tough, I think, on the industry. But again, they're a critical industry, and they've got loads of money and loads of investment. I see this as the time where we need those strong guardrails more than ever.
Yeah, and on the renewable side, so the energy storage is really interesting, and one of the things I really want to do is I don't know when I'll be able to, but I really want to go to China. China seems to be leading on battery storage, like, especially electric vehicles. They have some really interesting things that they're doing and innovative where I think they're innovating. And that I think sometimes there's an unfair critique on China that they don't innovate. I think they do. So I'd be curious if energy storage, and then I guess to tie it back to the US, if we need US battery storage, Tesla's working on things, and maybe we can learn something from China in terms of battery storage, because I think it's Shanghai that there's a gigafactory for Tesla, that we could learn something there too, potentially, for battery storage. So that's something I've been interested in, and hopefully I could travel to Shanghai and Shenzhen. And I don't know if you know about BYD, but that's kind of bucket list item to do.
But I hope you get to do it. It's a beautiful country and great food as well.
Yeah, it's yeah. So on the to-do list, we'll see. Okay, so that wraps it up for all the data center stuff. Let's get into the fun question. So, what do you do when you're not worried about sustainability for fun? So you mentioned hiking. I've had a chance to go to Joshua Tree. I have not climbed Mount Whitney yet, but that's a goal of mine. So, what are some of your hobbies?
So let me turn my camera and I'll give you so I'm located at UC Santa Barbara, and I don't know, it's a little late in the day now, but what looks gray out there, that's the ocean. So I like getting out into it when I can. I mean, swimming or going even boogie boarding with my son, or fishing. We've got wonderful mountains here too, so I like to hike with my family. We live not too far from the ocean and the bluffs, so it's a wonderful place to go on a weekend morning with our little dog, that sort of thing. So I try to get out into, just nature and breathe fresh air and explore, because I've always loved being outdoors. I've always loved natural beauty and being a part of it and doing physical exercise. So biking, all the above, all the things that you can do outdoors in a place like this, I try to do.
Yeah, I mean, California really does have best of all worlds when it comes to like you said, mountains and beaches. It's very unfair, but yeah, yeah, I love hiking as well, so I could definitely relate there. Final question. Do you have any book recommendations? Could be something you read recently, could be something pertaining to our conversation, or could be something totally off the wall if you want.
Sure. I wish I had a very current one. Most of what I read these days are research papers that are coming out about the energy use of this or the water use of that as it comes to data centers. And it's fun just because there's so much research, great research coming out. But I have sort of an oldie but goodie that I loved when I was younger. And it's a bit old, and it's a book, and there's even a video series called Connections by this science journalist named James Burke. And so if you Google Connections on YouTube, you could watch a bunch of old BBC programs under this series called Connections. And what James Burke did is he looked into sort of the history of innovation and the coincidences that occurred and how one innovation led to another and that forwarded our technological progress and societal progress. And he looks at all sorts of inventions over time. And there's a book he wrote, I think it came out after the television series was put out, that kind of explains in really fun and interesting and inspiring language about how innovation happens and how connections, whether planned or kind of by happenstance, have led to a lot of innovations that we have today. I'd recommend reading that. It's just a fun read, and it's fascinating just to learn about how things came together. So hence the name Connections, and the author is James Burke, Burke.
Awesome. So I'll link that in the description as well. Dr. Eric Masanet, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks. It was a lot of fun. I know we talked for a while. It was a blast to talk about all these issues. You had great questions, and I look forward to chatting again sometime.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, and thank you everybody.
Sure. Take care.